Thank you so much for joining me today on the Compassion Fatigue podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Blau. You're listening to session 25. My guest today is Mariann Sullivan. She is the host of the Animal Law podcast and co-host of the Our Hen House podcast. Mariann is also a lawyer and lecturer in law, teaching animal law at Columbia Law School. She is the former chair of the Animal Law Committee of the New York City Bar Association and the American Bar Association's Tort Trial Insurance Practice Section's Animal Law Committee. She has published a number of articles on farmed animals and the law, as well as the Animal Welfare Act, and has spoken at numerous conferences and animal law-related events throughout the country, as well as internationally. In addition to her current stint at Columbia, Mariann has taught animal law at Lewis and Clark Law School Center for Animal Law Studies, NYU Law School, Brooklyn Law School, and Cardozo Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mariann Sullivan. Hi, Mariann. Thanks so much for joining us today on the Compassion Fatigue podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Jennifer.
Oh, I appreciate you coming on. I think this is a really interesting subject. And before we kind of dive into this, can you tell our listeners, what exactly is animal law?
Animal law can cover a wide variety of topics, and there are, of course, laws that specifically regulate the way animals are treated. There are cruelty laws in every state. Even every state now has a felony cruelty law as well as a misdemeanor cruelty law. Those are criminal laws, and those are clearly animal law. And then there are usually regulations about how you can use animals and how many animals you can have, perhaps, or what kinds of animals can be kept as pets, all sorts of regulations like that. And then there's a lot of laws or legal situations revolving around companion animals. Whether landlord-tenant law can affect companion animals quite a bit, and estate practice law. What do you do to protect your companion animals if and when you should die? And lots of ways that the law can affect the way people and their companion animals interact. Perhaps your dog has bitten somebody. Then there are the sort of broader uses of animals, the uses of animals in industry, the uses of animals for food. And there are laws protecting animals in those situations, some. The federal law has an Animal Welfare Act that has minimal but important regulations on how animals are treated in certain industries, in the pet trade, the wholesale pet trade, not the retail pet trade, in research and in entertainment. But it doesn't cover farm animals, which I think is a little odd considering it's called the Animal Welfare Act, and farm animals constitute 99% of the animals we use. And there are really very few laws protecting farm animals. They're even excluded in a variety of ways from state cruelty laws. And studying that is also an issue of law, but it's not so much studying specific laws that set out to protect animals. It's studying how the law fails to protect animals. And in my class, we delve into some consumer protection laws. What does it mean if somebody tells you that the food you're eating came from humanely raised animals? Does that have to be true? Should you trust that? And all sorts of First Amendment issues come into this, some of them affecting animal activists. We're getting a spate of what they call ag-gag laws around the country. One just passed in Arkansas just the other day. It was signed by the governor, which kind of prevent activists from getting jobs at factory farms and finding out what's happening there, trying to keep it a secret what's happening to animals. There are other First Amendment issues that might protect people who there was an important Supreme Court First Amendment case about dogfighting videos, and can laws ban depictions of animal cruelty, or is that a First Amendment violation? And it turns out that it is a First Amendment violation, and there are First Amendment rights protecting those kinds of activities. So it's just, it starts out, and in my class we start out really with laws that are specifically protecting animals, but animals really reach into every part of our lives, and so they reach into almost every part of the law. There are antitrust issues involving animals, so it's really an enormous topic. When I first started teaching, I worked at a court at the time, and one of the judges there said, "How would you do a whole course on that? Isn't it just a cruelty law?" And That was a judge too. And it's amazing how people don't realize how, humans run the world, and they run the world through their laws. And those laws affect animals in many, many different ways.
So this judge says, you can teach a whole course on that. My God, I'm thinking this could be a whole degree program, right? I mean, this is such a complex issue, right? And from my understanding, this is a relatively new field. Am I correct? It dates back to the 70s, 80s, something like that?
Yeah, yeah. About then was when the Animal Legal Defense Fund was founded by the wonderful Joyce Tischler and some other lawyers. And they started nobody really, we had cruelty laws. We passed cruelty laws way back in the 1800s. New York had the first. Henry Bergh, who founded the ASPCA, was a campaigner for animals, passionate campaigner, and had mostly to do with the treatment of horses. That was the huge issue at the time, which shows you how times change. And then we had those laws, but nobody really thought of animal law as a field, as really a way of looking at the way the law affects animals and whether it protects them and whether it doesn't, until really the Animal Legal Defense Fund was founded, I guess, in the late 70s or early 80s. And then it just caught on so quickly. And now well over 150 law schools have a course in animal law. And as you said, it could be a whole field of study. I mean, there aren't degree programs in special areas in law schools. Everybody just gets the same degree, but there are certainly areas of specialty. And now 2 law schools have total programs that have a variety of courses in animal law. Lewis and Clark had the Center for Animal Law Studies for quite a few years, and Harvard just founded its own division in its law school to look at the way animal law is taught and to teach a variety of courses, and they have a fellow in animal law. So yes, it isn't just like the animal rights movement, which has really grown apace with the animal law movement. Our concern for how animals are treated, people have always been concerned, but bringing it into the legal realm has really happened over the past 30 years and has speeded up tremendously in the past 10.
Yeah, so I'd say on the one hand, we're growing leaps and bounds, but on the other hand, we're still so far behind, right? So think about this, for our listeners who may not know this, the USDA's website has been scrubbed of all animal welfare information as far as like animal cruelty cases and whatnot. And so what impact does that have on the work that you and others in this field are trying to do?
Yeah, and when I said that it was growing by leaps and bounds, I didn't mean that the laws were improving. People are looking at it a lot more.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
the laws, the treatment of animals is certainly not improved. In fact, while we have made some progress legally, the numbers of animals that are subjected to horrific cruelty it's staggering.
It's
Now, let
overwhelming.
me
Yeah.
let me get to your specific question. Yes, as I mentioned before, the federal law does have a law called the Animal Welfare Act that provides important protections to animals in these 3 industries: the wholesale pet trade, entertainment, and research. And one of the things that the USDA does is it inspects facilities in these areas, and it keeps records of what people who hold animals in these areas are doing. And that gives activists and lawyers who are interested in this an enormous amount of material to work with in finding out what's happening, because, of course, what happens to animals goes on mostly behind closed doors. It's not public. So without this information, it's really impossible to know. And we have a right to that information. And it's not, the USDA doesn't deny that we have a right to that information. And in order to make it easier and to comply with the Freedom of Information law, which requires them to make it easier, they had put all this information on the website, and they have recently taken it all down. And it's devastating to people working in those areas. They need this information if they're going to find out what's happening to animals, who's violating the law, whether those violations are being redressed, what lawsuits possibly could be brought. And if you're really people who are really interested in this topic, I recently did an interview, actually episode 22, which is the most recent interview on the Animal Law podcast, where we went into this in detail. And my guest was Delciana Winders, who is the Harvard Fellow in Animal Law, and she specifically studies this area. And you'll be happy to know that she and others are bringing lawsuits against the USDA to try to rectify this situation. So yeah, it's very, very disheartening. We have we have not come that far in protecting animals, and it's very hard to see anything going backwards. Though, as I mentioned, this doesn't have anything to do with farm animals or many, many other animals, because the federal law just doesn't protect them at all. So they don't keep that information regarding farm animals.
Well,
It's
yeah,
not
it's hard to protect something when you don't even consider it an animal, right? So, for example, it's my understanding that like poultry, well, they're not really animals, so right, so they
well,
don't need protection.
there is law in states. Well, I don't know whether anybody's ever held that they're not animals. They not with, law works with definitions, and there is at least one case that has said that when the legislature passed a law protecting animals, they didn't mean to include poultry. But I'm not sure that the USDA doesn't consider them animals, but Congress wrote a law protecting farm animals from just at the time when they're being slaughtered. And it doesn't provide for a lot, but it provides that they have to be handled, quote unquote, humanely. They don't spell that out very clearly, what that means. And people have very different ideas of what that means. And it also provides that they have to be unconscious when their throats are slit. I mean, it seems that's the least anybody could do to protect these animals. I mean, God help us if you can't even do that. And it has been held that that law doesn't apply to poultry, which, we're talking about billions and billions and billions of animals every single year. There's no law that requires them just to be unconscious when their throats are slit. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, really, and I could go on for hours about this, but
Yeah.
I'm going to control myself. So, before we so I want to talk about the future of animal law, in your opinion. But before that, let's kind of take a step back, and I want to know about what led you to this field in the first place. Kind of take us back there.
Yeah, it was a dog, as it is for so many people. I mean, I always loved animals, like most people, and or like many people. I would say most people. Most people do love animals, which makes it confusing as to how we got where we are. But back to me. For the first time in my life, I had my own dog. We had dogs when I was growing up, and I was living alone at the time with my dog, and I just started to notice how much was going on here, more than I had ever imagined. And I loved him so much, and I became fascinated by him and by dogs in general. And I started to think about animals. And because I was a lawyer, I started to think about them as they related to the law. And I was lucky enough that I lived in a city, this was back in the 80s. I lived in a city that had the first animal law committee at a bar association. New York City's Bar Association, the city bar, I think it was the first animal law committee in the country. And I think now most bar associations have animal law committees. But it gave me an opportunity, which is so important in any kind of work you're doing for animals, especially, given the topic of your podcast, compassion fatigue, especially in avoiding compassion fatigue. It gave me the possibility of meeting other people who shared this feeling and my interests, and who were also lawyers and who were working to help protect animals. And we were all a little at sea then. There wasn't a lot going on, and we weren't sure how to do things. But there were a lot of accomplished lawyers, and they found legislative projects they could work on, and that really got me going. That made me, that sense of being part of a group of people who really cared about this was just so, it made everything different. And I started studying about it, and I wrote a lot for that committee, which helped me be much more familiar with the laws and what was going on. And I ended up writing a few articles, and then I started teaching. I was lucky enough to get a teaching job, teaching animal law at Brooklyn Law School, and then eventually taught at other law schools, and at the same time did a little bit more research and writing. So it just, at the whole time, I was working at a job that had absolutely nothing to do with animals at a New York State court. So it just sort of, well, I won't say it just sort of happened, because I did make it happen, but I was very lucky in the people that I met and in the opportunities that I was afforded.
Yes, I imagine that's got to be really heartwarming to see a class full of students, young people who are interested in this subject.
Yeah, it is. And I still teach. I teach at Columbia now, and every year it inspires me. And it both inspires me and sort of perplexes me in that, as you said, these students really are interested in this topic. They certainly don't have to take this course, and they're usually passionate about animals. And even till today, they don't know that much. Well, a few of them do. I usually have a few activists who are very involved in animal protection organizations, but most of them really don't know what's going on. It's so secret and so hidden. And when we work in this area and we keep ourselves abreast of what's going on, we can lose. I can lose touch with the fact that people out there don't necessarily read about the latest undercover investigation. They're not getting Mercy for Animals newsletter. They're not on Humane Society of the United States email list. They have no idea. And I think it's so important for us to all remember that. And my students, I mean, it's heartening to see them interested. It's also heartening to see how deeply shocked they are. I have each of them do a report to the class about what's going on in a particular area of animal use. And because I don't want all that information to come from me, because they know I'm an activist, and I don't particularly like to talk a lot anyway. I always like to find ways to get my students to talk. And so each week somebody gives a presentation with a PowerPoint. They're very smart, and these are very sophisticated presentations on what's going on with animals in a particular area, not just the law, but just the facts. And they're so shocked, and it's a real wake-up call to me. These are students who care about animals, who self-selected to take an animal law course, and even they are frequently quite naive about how bad it is.
Yeah, I think people like you and I really kind of take for granted that we do have this awareness that probably most people in this world don't.
Yeah, I mean, we're all, regardless of whether we're animal advocates or anything else, we're all a little captured by our own Facebook feeds. And, we think that that's the news. Even when we know that's not true, we sometimes think that's the news that's reaching everybody. Well, it's not. And most people just really have no idea. I don't think any of us can afford to forget that. It's an ongoing process to get the word out there and make people, and people don't want to hear this because it's bad news, and it means that they might have to change their behavior. So there's even some resistance to learning about it. And because people care about animals, they hate hearing all this horrible stuff. So it's a constant need to get the word out, to tell people, to share these stories, to let people know any opportunity we have to let them know what's going on with animals.
What do you think is the future of animal law? And not just the next 4 years, which I'm terrified of, but kind of in our lifetime. Do you see any particular laws or any changes during our lifetime that you think will really make a big difference for animals? Or do you think this is, centuries away?
Well, the law is a very conservative institution, and it very, very rarely gets out ahead of public opinion. It generally follows public opinion. So a lot of what will happen in the law is going to depend on what happens in people's lives. And every activist working for animals has an enormous effect on what the law is going to do, because each time another person becomes aware, changes their habits, changes their attitudes, it's more likely that the law will then catch up and provide more protections. For me, I think that we're already moving away from animal products in eating in minimal ways, but it is happening. And I expect that to happen more and more, that, that now you can find non-dairy milks in every supermarket in the country very easily. And I'm talking about, not just in New York City, I mean every supermarket in the country. I was in West Texas not that long ago, walked into a supermarket, and there were plenty of almond and soy milk. So that's a very important step. I think that step will grow because we develop, these meat analogs, whether they're plant-based or cultured, what they call clean meat. They're starting to come on the market. If they do catch on, and I think it's up to every one of us to help them catch on. And if they do start to go the way that milk has gone, I think people will be eating animals less. As people eat animals less, I think that it's possible that people will see animals differently. And I'm not even just talking about farm animals, though if we just helped farm animals, we would be helping the vast, vast majority of animals, because 99% of the animals we use in any way are farm animals. But even if, I think it will change. I think the reason people are blind to animals, and this is just my personal opinion, is largely because they eat them. I think it just creates an enormous denial. And the more that society moves away from that, and we are moving away from that, we're at the beginning stages, but it's happening. people will start to see animals differently. As people see animals differently, the law will catch up. The law will say, will pass protections so that so it isn't just the people who care about animals will be treating animals well and the others won't. We will have laws protecting all of them because it is, as I said before, the majority of people care about animals and don't want to see them treated cruelly. And if they start really wanting those laws and seeing animals more clearly and recognizing that animals are important. This is not a cute little issue. This is not a funny little issue. This is an area of deep moral concern. I think that as we stop eating meat, these impulses will grow. And as these impulses grow among people, the law will change. The law always follows. And hopefully, the harder we fight for changes in the law, the quicker it will follow. And I think all of that is possible. And I think what we will see on the legal side are more protections for animals. I don't think we'll see any bans on eating meat or anything like that. That will happen in people's own lives. But the more protections there are, the more requirements that animals be treated a little more decently, well, the more expensive these products are going to be because it's cheap to treat animals cruelly. And when that happens, people will turn more to other foods, and they will start seeing animals differently and opening up their hearts to them. That's my dream. And, I live by that. And that is really what I use to fight the theme of this podcast, compassion fatigue, because because having that hope, even if it's hard to imagine, it's so important in not giving up and not moving away. I think enormous change is possible. Enormous change.
Yeah, so I think the take-home message of what you're saying, which I think can get lost with a lot of people, including myself from time to time, is that, with every letter you write, with every petition you sign, with every veggie burger you eat, you are making a difference. You are making a dent, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, and it's not just letters to your legislators either. It's letters to the editor, and it's conversations and and going to protests and making animals visible in any way that you can. No, that's what's going to change the world. That's where it starts. Legislators are not going to suddenly pass a law protecting animals if people don't want that. I mean, we know what legislators are like. They want to do what people want them to do, and they want to do what money wants them to do, and money wants them to not protect animals. And unless people are very, very strongly demanding that they do that, it's just not going to happen. We all know that's the way the world works. It's not going to work differently for animals. One animal protection group being in Washington is not going to change the world. It has to be. If legislators get loads of letters on something, they pay attention. If newspapers get loads of letters on a topic, they publish those letters. If people hear from 3 of their friends that veggie burgers are delicious and get handed a brochure about what's happening on factory farms, they're more likely to change. Ultimately, this is a grassroots movement. Sure, there are major groups doing wonderful work leading it, but we all have to lead it, whether it's to create art, to write, to talk, to go into schools. We have to spread the word. People just don't know.
Yeah, and so I think that, you mentioned something really important, that it's these little victories, really, that I like to call them, that kind of keep your hope alive and fight this kind of pervasive demon that is inherent in this field, which is called compassion fatigue and ultimately burnout. Have you ever personally struggled with any of these things? Or if not, how do you keep compassion fatigue at bay with all the things that you're exposed to in your daily work?
I'm not sure that I ever have, which may make me a bad guest for your podcast. One of the reasons
No, you must be really resilient.
Well, I don't. For one thing, very early on in doing this, as I said, I met a bunch of people who cared about animals, and I think that makes unbelievable difference. Another thing is that I know a lot of people who listen to your podcast probably work hands-on with animals who are struggling, who have been abused, who are homeless, who have needs, and working with animals is very tough work. And I think that it can really wear people out. I don't work with, I have my dog who I love. I don't really work with animals. And in some ways, I think that makes me less exhausted by the whole process. I'm not saying that this doesn't happen. I mean, in the legal world, it's depressing. I mean, some of the cases that you look at and that have been lost, that just were outrageous. And I sometimes, I may not have been litigating them personally, but there are cases I can't bear to teach. And I'm going to talk just about one of them. The ASPCA versus Ringling was a case that I have to teach every year because it's an important case. And it's a case that went on for 10 years of litigation. The animal advocates won an important victory early on in being allowed to bring the case. And ultimately it was lost after 10 years of litigation. By 10 years of litigation is intermittent. It doesn't happen all the time. But so it's not like they went into court every day. But the case dragged on and on and on. And they brought in enormous evidence about what was happening to elephants at Ringling. And ultimately, they after all of this time, they lost the case on a technicality. And they were sued for attorney's fees. It was a tragedy, absolutely a tragedy. Just reading about it and teaching about it every year when I have to do it, it gets me down. But, sometimes you have to take the long view. And as we all know, this year Ringling closed down. And that case was probably not the least of it. It brought a lot of attention to the issue. And a lot of towns, municipalities started passing laws preventing elephants from coming with the circus by banning bullhooks or just banning the circus, and eventually the writing was on the wall. So if you take the long view with the law, sometimes things work out, even though they seem in the short view to be very, very despair-inducing. And there is a great deal of that in law. I mean, I tell my students that all the time. As a matter of fact, I told them that last week. I said at the end of class, I know everything we talked about today was really depressing, but next week we're going to have better news. And it can be very depressing, but you got to take the long view. If we don't do it, nobody's going to do it. There aren't that many people out there who are really working to protect animals. So if you are a person who has that in your heart, you have to take care of yourself so that you don't burn out. And we talk about that a lot on my podcast, Our Hen House, which I do with Jasmine Singer. And burnout is something that we all need to work on avoiding. And I do think you probably know 10 times more about this, 100 times more about this than I do. But I know that finding people of like mind and taking care of yourself, recognizing that you're an animal too, are both very important parts of that. And I hope that people listening do find those resources to take care of themselves, because it is a long haul, but victory is out there. So it would be nice to be around for that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can't, so kind of looking back, trying to think of the last circus protest I did, I would never in a million years have imagined standing there with my sign protesting the poor treatment of the animals at Ringling, that one day I would awaken to the news that Ringling was shutting down. I just never in a million years. And I think that just goes to show everything you do matters. And I know we feel like, gosh, we're just like this one little person. You can make a difference.
Yeah, you really can. And that was a good day, wasn't it, Jennifer?
Oh, I thought I was dreaming. I really did,
Yeah, we don't get too many days that good. But the thing is that the numbers are so overwhelming. The number of animals that are suffering is so overwhelming. But each of them is a life. So even if you have saved one, it has been worth it. And I'm sure many of your listeners have saved far more than that. And if you have prevented one from living in the horror and hell that these animals live in, it has all been worth it. You don't have to save everyone to make it worth it. You just have to save one. And just because the numbers are enormous and you're not saving all of the rest doesn't mean your time wasn't worth it. It was completely worth it.
Absolutely. And going back to self-care, we've talked about this on past episodes, but it really is, you have limited resources and you have to fill the gas tank every now and then in order to keep doing that. You can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders.
Yeah, no, I think this is the biggest issue for people, is that they just do too much. And I don't blame them. These animals are dying. Like when you're confronted with this horror and you don't have enough, well, even if you do have support, just knowing what's going on gets you down. And then you want to save as many as you can. How can you stop and go to a movie and go home and take a bubble bath to take care of yourself when you know that what you're doing actually saves lives? It's very, very difficult, but you have to do it. We all have to learn to pace ourselves, or else we're not going to be any good for them.
Yeah, because going to that movie and taking that bubble bath is energizing you. That's what it's really doing when it comes down to it. And I get it. I used to struggle with that same guilt until I realized thousands upon thousands of dollars later in a grad school degree in psychology that really it is that self-care that, and I still struggle with it. I'm going to force myself to go to the gym today. But I'm realizing that self-care, it really is, it's refueling that tank to give you the energy to go out there and do what your heart is calling you to do.
Absolutely. You have to do it. And I think you can also find ways to be really helpful to animals that don't wear you down. And one of them is with food. Sharing great vegan food is enormously helpful to animals. It saves lives. Maybe it's abstract, and maybe you don't see that animal, and maybe you don't know exactly what impact your actions have, but it has enormous impact. We've already seen that in the way that industries are struggling. And that's fun. So you can find and enjoyable and makes people happy and gets you friends. So you don't have to do just things for animals that are really, really hard and brutal. You can also find things to do that actually energize you and make you happy and are helping animals a whole lot.
Yeah, and you're helping, your own health and your friends' health and your family's health along the way.
Absolutely. It's like win-win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you are the executive director of Our Hen House, and of course, you mentioned you have your own podcast that you co-host. For our listeners who maybe are not aware of that organization, can you tell us about those two projects?
Yes, Our Hen House has had a family of different media opportunities because we think it's so important for us to all be communicating with each other. Its goal is to be, and this ties into what I was just saying, indefatigably positive. And I think that's one of the things that's kept me going. We're not really conveying all of the horrible things that happen to animals. So of course that does come up, but that's not our role. Our role is to convey all of the wonderful things that people are doing for animals and to share those people with the rest of you and to get their stories out. And we do have a weekly podcast, which has two interviews. We have one interview with a major figure in the movement, perhaps either somebody running an animal rights organization, a writer. We just had Barbara King on, who's written a number of very popular books about animals, and philosophers and people who have major voices. And we always also have one interview with somebody who's working at the grassroots level and who's really getting the work done and speaking out for animals in their own community, in their own way, whether it's going to protests, whether it's sharing food. Unbelievably inspiring people doing wonderful work on the ground. And we know that by sharing these stories with people who also care about animals, it's going to hopefully inspire them and also just maybe relieve some of that compassion fatigue by creating community. I mean, some people have a natural community and some people really don't. There was one week we received 2 letters. One was from a woman who lives on Niue Island in the Pacific, which is apparently a country, which I never heard of. She's the only vegan on the island. She's all by herself.
Well, I thought I was lonely.
And another was from a woman who's living in rural Saskatchewan, living vegan, advocating for animals. These are people who don't have anybody in their life who shares their values for animals. And I love reaching those people and giving them the feeling that they have community. That community that I felt was so important to me when I first started out. And I guess that's one of the reasons that inspires me to do this. I also do some news on the podcast to keep people up to date on what's going on. And we have one section that I do every week called Rising Anxieties, which is basically taking news stories from the industry and showing that they're completely panicked about what's happening. And they really are so defensive and dishonest. And I think it inspires people to show how on the ropes the industry feels that it is. They're constantly talking about animal activists. So we do that podcast every week. We've done it for 7 years. Every single week it comes up on every Saturday, and you can find it at ourhenhouse.org. And I also do a podcast on my own called the Animal Law Podcast. And that's what I referenced before when I said I had Delcy Winders on talking about the USDA wipeout of information. And every month I publish that, and I interview somebody who's actually working in animal law, who's actually litigating a case or has just litigated a case. And they go into real detail about the legal issues, the legal technicalities about what happened in the case. And, I meant it to be for lawyers, and it is meant for lawyers and for law students because we do get pretty deep into the weeds. But I have found that a lot of people who aren't lawyers do seem to really enjoy it. And maybe, people tell me they miss a few things, like when we say race judicata or something, but basically, can follow a theme, and they're inspired to hear from all these wonderful lawyers who are doing all of this work and finding out what's going on in some detail. So I love doing that because I love doing all of it because we're able to bring a voice to people who are doing this kind of work and share that voice with others who care. And I think that that's how I avoid compassion fatigue because, as I said, we try to keep it positive. It's not really all about horrible things that are happening to animals. I mean, that's the context in which this is happening, but we're really, really dwelling on what people are doing to help them.
I have to agree with that. Every time I interview a guest, such as yourself, for my own podcast, it really, I have found that it really is a form of healing for myself. And I think, a lot of it has to do with that community. So research has shown that in addition to self-care, support really is just absolutely imperative when it comes to fighting off compassion fatigue and stress and burnout. And so I think like that woman in the tiny little island, it doesn't have to be an in-person support group, it can be an online community of people. And I think that's one of the best, advantages of the internet is we can connect with other people around the world. And it makes it a little bit less lonely place to be because this kind of lifestyle, it can be lonely. But the thing is, we're not alone. And again, the takeaway is we're not alone and every little bit that you do matters. It really does.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's why I do what I do. And I think it's so valuable what you're doing because you're providing community for people who really are struggling. And we all struggle. It gets you down. Knowing this information and dealing with people in your life, people whom you love and who you care about, who just don't get it, are just ignoring what's happening to animals. It's incredibly painful. But I just feel that I feel like we're a nation. The people who care about animals are a nation in and of ourselves. And we're all around the world. And I mean, I'm just incredibly inspired by hearing what people are doing in circumstances that are so much tougher than anything I've ever faced. And I just really feel that if you went anywhere in the world and you dropped down out of the sky, you would find somebody there who cared about animals and who knew exactly, who got it. And being able to connect with those people, at least in this virtual way, it keeps me going. I mean, I just feel like I'm so fortunate to be able to have these conversations with people every week. It's just added so much to my life.
That's awesome. So, Mariann, how can people learn more about you, the podcast, and Our Hen House?
At ourhenhouse.org. You can find the podcast there and the Animal Law Podcast, or you can really find them on, virtually any podcatcher that you use, Downcast or whatever. You can just look up Our Hen House or Animal Law Podcast and you'll find us. And you can email me at Mariann@ourhenhouse.org.
Great. And so, Mariann, what I'm going to do for our listeners is I will put up all those links in the show notes page section at thecompassionfatiguepodcast.com. So if you are out and about driving around or at the gym doing a little self-care and you're listening to this podcast, once you get home, log onto your computer, you can find all those links there. Mariann, thank you so much for coming on as a guest today and for all of the work that you do for animals. I really appreciate it.
Well, right back at you, Jennifer.
All right. Take care, Mariann. Thank you so much for listening to the Compassion Fatigue Podcast. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or colleagues who you think might benefit from this important information. Please head on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show and check out the CompassionFatiguePodcast.com where you can find additional resources such as a link to join our private Facebook group. Please note that this podcast is not meant to provide medical advice or substitute for psychological care. Please consult with a mental health professional if you feel you need additional support, and if you are feeling suicidal, please go to your nearest emergency room or call 911.